Hey, hello everyone. This is Ben Norton. This is Moderate Rebels Live. You probably have seen, if you follow the news in any way, that there was a big story in Yahoo News this week admitting that the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency, plotted to kidnap and also assassinate Julian Assange, the journalist, political prisoner, founder, and editor of WikiLeaks while he was trapped in the Ecuadorian embassy in London. So we're going to talk about that story today. Max, my colleague, actually reported this back in 2020, over a year ago. And of course, because it was reported at the Grayzone, an independent media outlet, and it was because it was Max reporting it and not a mainstream pro CIA journalist. Of course, it didn't get much attention at the time. But now Michael Isikoff, who is one of the CIA's loyal allies in the media, has admitted this in a major story at Yahoo News. So we know that the CIA was considering assassinating Julian Assange, an incredible crime.
All these spooks going to Michael Isikoff, who relied on them to guide his Russiagate reporting, to confirm my reporting in the Grayzone on Julian Assange and the CIA proposal to eliminate Assange through assassination or kidnap him. Why did they do that? I mean, it seems like they just hate Pompeo. He's looking like he's going to run in 2024 or be senator. He, was CIA director, and he probably was someone who was horrible to work for. And we all know from Russiagate, there's a faction of Democrats within the CIA. So now Pompeo's calling to prosecute all of the official sources in Isikoff's story. That's how journalism should function, by the way, but also it should provide some kind of analysis or context on why these figures are coming out.
Yeah, so this is the article that was published in Yahoo News. Again, I just want to stress Michael Isikoff is a hardcore Russiagator. He has pushed a lot of insane conspiracy theories, and our colleague Aaron Mate has done the best work in pushing back against him. In fact, Aaron, who is extremely patient, that guy has infinitely more patience than I do. He actually interviewed Michael Isikoff and just published their discussion over at the Grayzone. You can find that at our channel here at YouTube. And Aaron pushed back at some of his claims that, Max is going to talk further about the attempt to try to link Assange to Russia through this. And I think what Max said, there's two things happening. It's kind of nefarious. So it's good to see a mainstream corporate media outlet admit that the CIA tried to assassinate, or considered rather assassinating and kidnapping and poisoning Julian Assange, a journalist. But at the same time, I think there's two political reasons this article is allowed to be published. One, as Max said, the Democrats in the CIA who don't want Mike Pompeo to be president. Rightfully, I mean, people talked about Trump being a fascist. Mike Pompeo would be infinitely worse than Trump. I mean, Trump was awful, but Trump was ineffectual in a lot of ways and really dumb. Pompeo is one of the most evil people on earth. I mean, imagining him as president just gives me chills down my spine. So I think there's an element of that. There's the internal political partisanship. But I also think another reason this was allowed to be published is that this is pushing ridiculous Russiagate talking points within this article. So it's playing this nefarious role that admits that the CIA, under Pompeo specifically, was taking these ridiculous measures against Assange, but also tries to link it to Russia by spinning this vast conspiracy that Russia was supposedly working with Assange in WikiLeaks and was going to try to whisk Assange out of the embassy, which is partially justifying CIA spying on the embassy.
Yeah, this story was tracked closely with my report from May 2020 at the Grayzone. And what Isikoff brought to the table was, according to him and his team, 30 US officials, former and current, mostly intelligence officials, to confirm that the CIA did everything that I reported it did based on my own sourcing. And my sourcing, I actually think my sourcing was more reliable than theirs, but their sourcing will be trusted more because it's in the voices of US officialdom. Now, I guess what it was missing for me was the Sheldon Adelson angle, that the CIA ran the operation through Trump's largest donor, the late Sheldon Adelson, whose empire is now controlled by his widow, Miriam, and presumably by the Mossad. It's essentially an Israeli intelligence asset operating within the United States that's also doubled as a CIA asset on a number of occasions, as I revealed.
Max, I just
And
want to point out, I'm going to show
yeah.
people this is the article that you published. So this is over at the Grayzone. It's called "The American Friends: New Court Files Expose Sheldon Adelson's Security Team in U.S. Spy Operation Against Julian Assange." This is from May 2020. So Max scooped this story a year and a half ago. And now, of course, Russiagate Michael Isikoff is getting credit. But really, the main difference between Isikoff's story and Max's, even though it's basically the same story, is the presence of Sheldon Adelson and the fact that Isikoff got his CIA friends to confirm his story.
Yeah. So the way that I put this story together was through a trial that's ongoing in the Spanish National Court, actually the same court where Augusto Pinochet was tried. And because this court recognizes universal jurisdiction, the lead counsel for Julian Assange, Baltasar Garzón, is the same lawyer who presided over Pinochet's prosecution and whose office was mysteriously robbed, as I reported, apparently by these very CIA assets who were spying on Assange and plotting to kill him. So if we go back to the beginning, the early days of the Trump era and the Mike Pompeo CIA, a lowly Spanish security firm owner who was very ambitious named David Morales takes a trip to Las Vegas to a major security firm. There he's approached by an Israeli former former intelligence agent who is the chief security officer for Sheldon Adelson and his Las Vegas Sands, where the conference was being held. And they offer him a deal. Why did they approach him? Because this former Spanish special forces officer heading a firm called UC Global was in charge of security at the Ecuadorian embassy in London, and therefore in charge of the most wanted man for US intelligence, someone who was wanted as much as Osama bin Laden was, and that's Julian Assange. So Morales comes back to Spain, tells his employees, we're playing with the big boys now. Like, we have these American clients, and he's referring to the CIA very clearly. So under the watch of the CIA, they proceed, UC Global and all of the embassy guards proceed to swap out the cameras, the CCTV cameras that are presumably there to protect Assange, and pipeline the CCTV feed back to Washington and Las Vegas. And Morales started taking all these trips to Las Vegas and Northern Virginia, but mainly Las Vegas. And he was sending instructions from Las Vegas to his employees on how to create separate CCTV feeds, telling them where to put hidden microphones under a fire extinguisher to listen to Julian Assange's meetings with his lawyers, and running a gigantic spy operation. At one point, Morales proposes, well, first of all, Morales put forward even before I mention that, I should say, the dead giveaway that there was someone over Morales' shoulder who was a U.S. intelligence agent was that these instructions were written in perfect English. And if you listen to Morales talk, his English is very poor. He speaks very poor English with a thick Spanish accent. And he was mostly communicating in Spanish with his employees, who all mostly spoke Spanish. So how did I obtain all of these files and documents? That relates to the assassination plot. Morales first provided a list to his employees of people to watch out for who are Assange associates, not just working for WikiLeaks, but also Glenn Greenwald, various journalists who were visiting, and to specifically look for Russian ties, to open their devices when they came into the embassy, invade their privacy, and determine if they were connected to Russia. That was another priority of US intelligence, connecting Assange to Russia. Then Morales proposed some more extreme ideas. He sent one of his men after Stella Morris, who was the partner of Julian Assange, and sent this employee to steal a diaper from the trash can belonging to Stella Morris's child in order to connect the DNA of that child to Julian Assange, to determine that Julian Assange had a child. And I think, you think about the sick minds of some of the people directing this operation and whether they wanted to use Julian Assange's child as some kind of emotional blackmail to coerce him into giving up. That employee of UC Global actually approached Stella Morris on the street and said, "They're making me spy on you. This is happening. This is too much for me. I didn't sign up for this. I thought I was just like a lowly security guard." And then the wheels started to come off the operation. Morales proposed poisoning Assange or leaving a door open from the embassy to kidnap him. And one of his employees went to the Spanish police. The Spanish police launched their own investigation, began, I think, tapping Morales's phone while he was on Sheldon Adelson's yacht, the Queen Mary, named after his wife. And when Morales returned from a very mysterious trip to South America, which I'm trying to gather more information about, he was arrested and put on trial in the Spanish National Court, and his communications were seized, text messages, emails. The former employees, his business partners, testified against him and revealed everything. And I was able to obtain these transcripts and files. So I basically have the internal communications. I had the internal communications of the CIA's asset that it used to spy on, terrorize, and possibly consider assassinating Julian Assange and his associates. And that story, I think, should have triggered a wider cascade of stories in the media and outrage about what had happened. And I wasn't the only one. El País, which is a mainstream Spanish publication, published many of these details. Kevin Gustola had some of these details. Stefania Morizzi as well. And she was a journalist, an Italian journalist who was spied on in the embassy, had her devices seized. I also reported that Ellen Nakashima, the national security reporter for the Washington Post, had her devices seized. And she said nothing about this. I mean, if it had been Putin's FSB that had done it to her, it would have been a scandal. But the point is, following my story, there was silence. There was nothing in US media to follow this story up. On Twitter as well. No blue check marks working in mainstream media dared touch it. I guess because it's the Grayzone and because it's me, but they could have looked into it themselves. And it really has taken this long for a mainstream reporter to take this story seriously. And it was Isikoff going to his spook sources with his team that has done so. And still, there's very little follow-up on Isikoff's story. So we can see the whole mainstream press has totally abandoned Julian Assange. This is one of the wildest stories that's been reported in years. It's straight out of a Le Carré novel. It's perfect for like a Netflix series or a Hollywood blockbuster, but they won't touch it. Julian Assange has just been so demonized and so abandoned by the media that depended on him for so many years that they won't even touch this story. So Isikoff's story has a lot of flaws in it. I haven't seen Aaron's interview with him yet, but I think it's a positive development because it's putting more pressure on the media to report that the whole case against Julian Assange has fallen apart. And actually, it's those who have been persecuting Julian Assange who should be in prison, not him.
Absolutely. And I just want to point out this is the article, the other article that Max wrote that was also ignored. Mainstream US reporters silent about being spied on by apparent CIA contractor that targeted Assange. Honestly, of the stories that we've done on Assange that got ignored by mainstream corporate media and even by kind of left liberal progressive outlets, like on the slightly on the fringes, but still kind of more mainstream, this is the most ridiculous example of them totally ignoring the story because this directly impacts the press. And when Trump was president and when he criticized media and when he criticized journalists by name, they acted like it was the end of the world, that they were being attacked and it was, they're political prisoners and all this ridiculous nonsense. Meanwhile, here's an actual political prisoner, Julian Assange, who is being spied on 24/7 by the Trump administration, by the way. And the CIA was spying on mainstream journalists reporting on it, and they didn't care because it just shows, again, that so few mainstream journalists ever want to report critically on the CIA because they don't want to bite their hand that feeds them. And the Isikoff stories is still an example. It's actually not critical of the CIA. It's critical of Pompeo. And Isikoff tries to portray everything that happened as if it were all the fault of Pompeo, even though the CIA has done stuff like this, has not only plotted, but has carried out assassinations for decades, for the entire history of the CIA. And there's a good comment here from Luis, who wrote, Assange is Aussie and then Ecuadorian as well. And I don't know what his nationality is, but he's definitely not American. So how in the world can the US extradite him? That's a really good question. The US can't. I mean, it shouldn't be able to. If Britain does this, this is a massive legal precedent that says, well, illegal, but according to US law, that the US can extradite non-US nationals and then try them for supposedly violating its domestic laws. And it's not just Assange. Meng Wanzhou, the CFO who was just finally released from Canada, the CFO of Huawei, that is, she was held for 2 years by Canada because the US wanted Canada to extradite her, which is really just a form of rendition. They wanted to send her to the US to arrest her for violating US sanctions on Iran, which are totally illegal under international law. The US is violating the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the JCPOA, the nuclear deal. So the US thinks that it can. There's another case with a North Korean businessman who was trying to buy goods for North Korea, which is under sanctions. So the US is trying to extradite him as well from Malaysia. He was imprisoned in Malaysia. And then the most egregious example is Alex Saab, a Venezuelan diplomat who was hired. He was turned into a diplomat by the Venezuelan government because he was a businessman and he went around the region and to Iran and other countries to buy food to provide sustenance for the Venezuelan population, which is under an economic war, through what's called the CLAP food program, in which the Venezuelan government, gives food boxes to over 80% of the population to prevent them from going hungry, which the US wants them to go hungry. And there's been stories this week of in Iran, with the inflation caused by the US economic war, the food prices have been skyrocketing and it's hard for average people to buy food. This is a sadistic economic war on the people of Iran and the people of Venezuela.
Well, if
This
I
is
could
the
just
intentional
jump in,
policy.
if I could
And
just
one
jump
second, I'm
in.
almost done.
Yeah.
So we see now that the US is trying to extradite people from these countries for violating unilateral illegal US sanctions. It's not just Julian Assange. Unfortunately, Julian Assange is an example of multiple people, but Julian Assange is the most high profile, and Julian Assange is a journalist, and unfortunately, I think Julian Assange may be the most likely to be extradited. And if he's extradited, it establishes that horrible precedent that I was just talking about that would give the US legal precedent. It's still illegal under international law, but would give the US legal precedent in the US legal system to extradite anyone in the entire world out of the 7 billion people on earth, regardless of whether or not they actually are a US national. It's insane.
Yeah, I mean, just one point based on the cast of characters you outlined, Meng Wanzhou, her government fought for her. They actually established leverage against the country that has been annexed by the United States to our north, known as Canada. Which was, I mean, they just arrested her on orders from the US regime, but they established leverage by arresting the two Michaels, who they accused of subversion and spying, Michael Spavor and Michael Kovrig, who were working for NGOs and were accused of photographing sensitive Chinese military gear and so on. And so there was a swap for the two Michaels in exchange for Meng Wanzhou, who was basically, her threat was purely political or economic. She was the CFO of an economic competitor in a so-called great power competition. So the Chinese government fought for her and got
Well,
her
really
back.
quickly, Max, I just want to point out specifically that one of the main reasons she was arrested when she was arrested, it was to pressure Europe not to allow
Not to do
Huawei
5G.
to build 5G infrastructure in Europe, which happened. The
Right.
European Union gave in. So that was the Trump administration's way of preventing Europe from increasing a major economic partnership with China, and they succeeded. So
Yeah,
that's one of the
good
reasons that the
good
US
point.
allowed her to be freed, because they already had the intended impact.
Yeah, and I mean, the Biden administration might wanna be a little more cooperative. I heard there's some talks underway, but then you have Alex Saab, his government's fighting for him. The Venezuelan government is fighting for Alex Saab. They have made him a diplomat, who is a participant in the negotiations being presided over by Norway and Mexico City. So they're declaring that Alex Saab is part of our delegation and that you can't hold him. The Australian government has completely abandoned Julian Assange, which says everything about Australia's lack of sovereignty, just like Canada's. It's another kind of vassal state of the US, of the Five Eyes network, of NATO. We saw what the deal they just cut to buy nuclear submarines. Australia internally looks like a biomedical police state. It's not able to really it's not looking like very much like a liberal democracy right now, but it's certainly not sovereign, and it is really the front line of the US plan to contain China. And so Julian Assange, for the
Well, really
Australian government.
quickly, Max, to bolster
Yeah.
that point further, France has been pointing out the French military establishment, which is hilarious. I mean, one of some of the world's leading imperialists, they've been so angry about this AUKUS deal that they have actually been pointing out that the military in Australia does not have the capabilities, the personnel, the training, and the technology to maintain 8 nuclear submarines, which is what the US is selling them, and Britain. So France has been pointing out that if this deal goes through AUKUS, that the US is likely going to have its own personnel operating these nuclear submarines with the Australian flag, but with US personnel. So, I mean, in that case, talk about abandoning sovereignty. If you have a foreign military operating your submarines under your flag, like that, I can't think of an example more blatant of just being a total puppet, of just being a totally surrendering your sovereignty to a superpower. It's insane.
And there's news about Canada banning Huawei. It's making a decision on whether to ban 5G gear from Huawei right now, obviously under enormous US pressure. But the point I was just making is that Assange is really a man without a country. He has been completely abandoned, and people almost forget that he's not a US citizen. It's almost like taken for granted. He's been abandoned by the media, he's been abandoned by his country, and I think the Biden administration's goal, which was spelled out in a Stratfor email, ironically and chillingly published on WikiLeaks, is to keep Assange moving around or detained without ever having to legislate on his fate. And the Biden administration seems to kind of be kicking the can down the road, trying to keep Assange out of the limelight. Merrick Garland has made very few statements about him. No reporters are asking about him that I can think of. There have been vigils at Merrick Garland, the Attorney General's house, by some of Assange's supporters, which I think is really important. And I think that that's what makes this story so important. The media could easily establish a drumbeat right now for Julian Assange that would shame the Biden administration into acting. I really don't think they want to extradite him. They don't want to have a high profile trial right in Biden's backyard at this point. But anything is possible. And I can't believe they're continuing the appeal after Siggy the hacker, the key witness, the key figure behind this espionage charge, has admitted that he lied and that he was lying basically to get out of a child molestation charge. William Barr knew he was lying. I mean, we talked about CIA officers lying to start this off. William Barr has a long history with the CIA, and he also helped all the Iran-Contra felons get off. So William Barr knew that Siggy the hacker, former WikiLeaks associate, low level, kind of a nobody, was lying, and he went ahead with the um, espionage charge. And I should also mention, as I reported in my piece, I might have been the first person to report this. The Espionage Act charge was introduced in a federal district court the day after the CIA learned through UC Global that there was a plan to get Julian Assange out of the Ecuadorian embassy. So all of this kind of connects. And it all does go back to Pompeo with the Biden administration continuing the policy. I mean, there's a lot to say, but I think the emphasis here is that everyone watching has a role to play here in just keeping the pressure on.
Yeah, well said. We're gonna wrap up pretty soon because I'm gonna do a live stream over at Rockfin, and I know Max is gonna be doing a live stream later with Katie Halper. I want to point out before we wrap up here that a friend of ours, Stansfield Smith, published an article at the Grayzone called "World Police: Washington Seeks to Imprison Foreign Business People for Violating Illegal U.S. Sanctions," and he looks at these cases because Assange is pretty well known, and people might have heard of Meng Wanzhou, but Alex Saab is less known and much less known. I mean, I didn't even know about this case, honestly, until Stan wrote this article, is this North Korean businessman, Moon Chol-myung.
Yeah.
So it's really crazy to me that these cases are not getting more attention because the legal precedent this could establish, it would be the end of sovereignty for the planet. At least the U.S. would claim that it can extradite anyone on Earth, which I can't think of anything more Orwellian. There's all these media reports and constant attacks from Western governments claiming that like China is so authoritarian. And let's not forget that one of the excuses used for attacking China when it was passing the national security legislation is that China was trying to extradite these people in Hong Kong, not mentioning that one of the people that China was trying to extradite was this young man who murdered his girlfriend and then cut her up. And that was the person that China was trying to extradite. But there was this constant reporting claiming that China is violating human rights, and it's this authoritarian regime, and the people in Hong Kong are at risk of being extradited to the mainland and all of this. Meanwhile, the US is trying to extradite an Australian, a North Korean, a Venezuelan, and a Chinese national for supposedly violating US national law, and there's not a peep. I mean, for me, the double
Yeah.
standard couldn't be any clearer.
Well, somebody said earlier, I'm discrediting myself by going on Jimmy Dore and like that I would be taken more seriously. But the fact is, no one would know I existed. I mean, we have this platform, there's that, there are a few others, but the whole media is essentially, and if you looked at the way that the Beltway media reacted to Biden's withdrawal from Afghanistan after 20 years, it's just essentially a PR arm of the national security state. Go take a look at our Wikipedia page, which is written by one or two spooks and is basically one gigantic smear. These are
including Philip Cross, one of the most notorious.
But it's like a spook. I mean, he's, for all we know, it's a team of British spooks in a room claiming they're Philip Cross. But once you step away from the narrative, whether it's on Russiagate or whatever, the national security state wants to coerce people into believing, you disappear. And so, that's why I think we're here on YouTube for now, but we could be gone tomorrow. And we're seeing a new censorship regime come in on YouTube, focusing on the biomedical issue. I can't even say certain words on this without being flagged. It's very frustrating. And everyone's, there's a lot of, infighting as well, but it's obvious if YouTube has to implement this kind of censorship. We saw Ron Placone get locked out of his YouTube account today. Nico House, I think, is locked out of his YouTube account today. The Ron Paul report, I'm not sure if they got back in after some protests, but it appeared that thousands of their videos had been deleted. And then many others who are questioning a dominant narrative right now. Whatever you think of it, this really shows you what YouTube is. YouTube is owned by Google. It is enacting and protecting the interests of industry, which are completely intertwined with those of the regulatory bodies and the national security state and US government that they have completely captured. That's sort of the essence of empire. So YouTube has become an imperial platform, and who knows how long we're going to be here. that's why me and Ben have shows at Rockfin. That's a big reason. So definitely check out Ben's show right after we end this propaganda. Now, don't watch me, watch because I'm going to be on YouTube, I think. So I can't say anything. I'm like talking with, one hand tied behind my back. But no, seriously, support Ben's show. He's coming on right after this. Ben, if you drop a link maybe in the chat.
Yeah, we'll do.
And
In
YouTube has
fact,
also removed RT Deutsch, the German outlet of RT, which is one of the most watched news channels in Germany, obviously, because someone in the Biden administration said, get that Russian misinformation off there. And
I
like,
mean, actually, it was probably the German government.
it could have been
That's
the
the
German government too, but I question that, given that Germany is playing ball with Russia on some level.
Yeah, I mean, there's internal conflicts, and we'll see where it goes, especially after the most recent election. I mean, I think it might be related to the election in some way, but it's pretty crazy. And Russia actually responded to YouTube censoring it RT by threatening to ban YouTube in Russia. So we see again that YouTube, which is belongs to Google, which is of course a CIA and military contractor, continues to act as an arm of the U.S. government. So it's yeah, Abby Martin lost her RT channel. So there's an insane amount of
I
censorship.
mean,
But
I haven't heard that. So does that mean Breaking the Set just disappeared?
I guess that's what they're referring to. That all of
I
the
mean,
old
that's
Breaking the
crazy.
Bad videos are gone.
That's crazy. I mean, I'll have to check in on that. But you know who's going to be there on YouTube? Who's going to be there forever? Is TYT. They'll always be there.
So
Check out Emma
Beverly
Vigilant
Jensen
for some
asked,
real.
"Can Grayzone go on Rockfin?" We are on Rockfin. I guess we can make a new channel just for Grayzone, but Max and I are on Rockfin. We do weekly streams at least once a week, and this stream right now is also being streamed over at Rockfin. So definitely check us over there. And we're gonna end this stream actually here because we both have to jump off. But you can find me over at rockfin.com/Benjamin Norton, and I'll be doing another hour of a stream.
Yeah, and you can find me forever on YouTube at YouTube/David Packman.
Yeah. But
All right. Well,
you can find Max at rockfin.com/Max Blumenthal.
wait, there's just a quick someone chimed in. Abby Martin said that. Oh no, no, forget it. We'll find out who's banned, and we'll see who's banned in the coming days. The
Hard to keep
massacre
track as so
continues.
many people get banned.
Yeah, it's becoming a badge of honor. But we're still here. So thanks to everyone who supported us. Thanks for all the super chats, and me and Ben will be back next week. Peace.